Hi, sorry about that. This is Professor Unmac, and I am going to do a quick narrated PowerPoint for the third set of Locke readings. I apologize that this is coming a little bit later than I thought, but I got pressed into service as a COVID-19 mask maker, so I've been firing up my sewing machine and making masks for people. So this is the last of the John Locke discussion question sets, and it covers the causes of revolution and the right to revolution. And I love this part of John Locke. So the first thing that I want to talk about are the things that Locke says could cause revolution. It's important to remember that Locke doesn't really think that the people will revolt against a government that is not violating their rights, or against a government that is sort of taking care of business and functioning within the scope of the power that the government was set up to exercise. Locke doesn't believe that people are irrational. He doesn't think that rational people would just willy-nilly put their lives on the line to engage in a revolution. So mostly what Locke is arguing is that if there is a revolution, it's because of something the government did or something the government didn't do. And this is one of the areas where Hobbes and Locke are different, because if you remember, Hobbes makes the argument that revolution is always unjust because the government cannot violate the social contract, according to Hobbes, because they're not part of the social contract. So anything the government says is necessary to keep people safe is just. Locke doesn't believe that. Locke believes that people have natural rights, that the government's power should be limited, and that the people have a right to revolt against a government that doesn't respect its rights or that violates its rights. And so for Locke, the government can violate the social contract to the point where it would be rational, it would make sense for the people to revolt against the government and set up a new government. And he starts out by talking about some of the things that the chief executive could do. So we think of the chief executive either as the president of the United States as our chief executive, but this could be a prime minister, it could be a premier, it could be a king. And Hobbes has a section in chapter 19 where he talks about the different causes of revolution. And essentially, there are 5 specific things that the chief executive could do, but they kind of boil down to a couple of main points. One is interfering with the other parts of the government doing their job, or acting in a dishonest way, or not doing their job at all, right? So that the government isn't serving the purpose for which it was created. So he thinks that the chief executive can violate the social contract in a number of ways. He can substitute his will for the will of the people as expressed through the legislature. Remember, it's the legislative branch that establishes what the law is. And Locke argues that this is the one branch that absolutely has to be elected in a properly constructed civil society. He thinks that the people should always retain the right to change the leadership of the people who are making the law. So if the chief executive, who might not be elected, the chief executive might be a king, the chief executive might be somebody appointed by the legislature, but it doesn't have to be somebody who's elected. And so if the chief executive ignores the will of the elected branches and then substitutes his own law and says the laws of the legislature are no longer the laws of the land. In our circumstance, if you think about if the president suspended the Constitution and said, I'm no longer going to abide by the Constitution, there's no right to free speech, there's no right to freedom of religion, I'm going to take away everybody's guns, nobody gets a jury trial. Those are the kinds of things that we might look at as people and say, whoa, 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 we won't tolerate that from our chief executive. At least Locke says people probably wouldn't tolerate that from their chief executive for very long periods of time. He also says that if the chief executive blocks the legislature from acting, so if the legislative branch and the executive branch are in conflict with one another, and right, Locke is writing at a time before the United States of America was created, so there was no like veto power kind of thing, checks and balances, separation of powers. So Locke is envisioning where the chief executive would use their powers, say, for example, to control the military, to stop the legislature from acting, to close up the Capitol and not allow the legislature to meet for fear that they would be making laws that the executive doesn't like. That is something that could cause the people to revolt against the chief executive. Altering the electoral process. This is actually kind of an interesting one because we don't really think about that happening in the United States very often, that the government, the president or say the governor of a state would simply say, we're not going to have an election, or we're not going to let this group of people vote, or we're not going to let that group of people vote, or we're just going to appoint people to fill positions rather than allow the people to elect them. We're not anywhere near that direction in the United States, but we do have a lot of debates within the United States about efforts to suppress the vote. Now, because of this coronavirus, we are delaying, not getting rid of altogether, but delaying primary elections. And there's been talk about how can we conduct elections by mail, et cetera. What Locke says we shouldn't tolerate from a chief executive is a chief executive altering the electoral process to secure a political outcome beneficial to themselves. So it's one thing if you postpone a primary because there's an emergency. There's another if you cancel the primary because you don't think your preferred candidates are going to win. Surrendering to a foreign power, of course, that's pretty obvious. If the chief executive attempts to give control of the civil society to somebody that wasn't chosen by the people, who they didn't contract with in that sense, then that would certainly be something that the people wouldn't have to just take lying down. And then in general, not doing the job that they were chosen to do or given the power to do, not enforcing the laws. If those things happen, and if they happen in a severe enough way, then those are the kinds of things that Locke says might cause rational people to form a revolution or attempt a revolution. So in general, if the laws can't be enforced, if the laws aren't enforced, either because the chief executive won't enforce them, refuses to allow them to be enacted in the first place, or refuses to enforce them, or turns the power of the government over to a foreign government, then the social contract is void. And the people are no longer obligated to abide by a social contract that is no longer being met by the government. And it might not even be the government's fault, right? If there's economic collapse or if there's an invasion of some sort, the contract can be broken, and the people are then free to align themselves with whatever group of people they think will secure their liberties again or govern in the way that they would agree to. So the laws can't or won't enforce. And Locke says that people don't have to wait until the government collapses to form a new social contract, right? So rational people can see the writing on the wall and say, look, we better do something quickly, because if we don't intervene now, if we don't take over the government, or if we don't break the social contract now, we're going to be a lot worse off down the road. So this is from the executive branch position. This is sort of what Locke argues could be the cause of revolution. And again, keep in mind that what he's saying is something has to happen to the government or by the government in order for a revolution to happen. People don't just wake up and say, hey, we've been living under this government for a long time and it's going pretty well, but there are a few things I don't like, so let's have a revolution, right? It doesn't work that way. Locke argues that the legislative branch can also trigger a revolution. And this is actually a really interesting part of what he says. If the legislative branch abuses their power, and tries to exert too much control over people, then they are violating the social contract. The legislature is violating the social contract. Because remember, Locke says that rational people will structure their government with very limited powers. And so what Locke says is if the people voluntarily have given up their power to write the laws and their power to enforce the laws to a government, it's the government's obligation not to go beyond the scope of the power that the people have given them. And if they do that, if they legislate in areas where they don't have any right to legislate in because they weren't given that power either in the Constitution or in the way the government was structured, or if they make laws that are designed to benefit themselves, to enrich themselves at the expense of the people or at the expense of the public good. So, for example, if they increase taxes on people and then use that tax revenue to give themselves huge giant raises or something, or they use that money to buy stock and then they divide up the proceeds from the stock or whatever. Those would be things that could trigger a revolution. So again, an example would be if the government took people's land, took people's property in the guise of needing it for the common good, and then don't use it for the common good, keep it for themselves. That could trigger a revolution caused by the legislature not performing their function properly. If they sell their vote to the executive, in other words, if they allow themselves to be bribed, if they turn over their responsibility to do what's in the public interest and agree to do what's in the interest of the executive instead, then that would be something that the people would not have to tolerate if they didn't want to. Sorry, I'm clicking all over. The next part of the reading that I asked you to do, and there are 2 or 3 questions that relate to this section of the PowerPoint, so you probably have the answers on your discussion questions spread out over a few different questions. I just kind of want to summarize Locke's argument. One of the things that Locke recognizes is that the very notion that the people have a right to revolution might make some people uncomfortable. He says, I can hear you now. I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, don't tell the people they have a right to revolution. If you tell them they have a right to revolution, they're going to want to revolt all the time, and things are going to just be chaotic. And every time people get angry or don't like something that the government does, there's going to be a revolution. So keep it under your hat that people have a right to revolution. And Locke says, well, here's how I would answer those people. First of all, the right to revolution exists whether the government recognizes it or not. It's not a right that the government has to allow the people to have. People who don't think that the government is doing the job that they were tasked with doing are not obligated to continue with that social contract. If one side, the government side, breaks the social contract by acting in ways that the people find abhorrent, then the people are not obligated to remain part of that social contract, whether the government is willing to recognize that right or not. Now, that's not to say that the government's not going to try to stop a revolution. The government's not just going to let people who are angry dissolve the social contract, but Locke says you can't keep the right from people by refusing to acknowledge that the right exists, because it exists whether it's recognized or not. He also says that he calls the right to revolution the best defense against rebellion. And what he means by that is that knowing that the people are not obligated to continue to allow the same group of people to hold power is going to keep those people in power from abusing that power. Knowing that they could lose their power is going to serve as a check to keep the government in check. And that's what he means when he says it's the best defense against rebellion. Knowing that the people have a right to revolution will make the government think twice before it engages in behaviors that would lead the people to exercise that right. The other thing that helps with that are elections. So it's not enough to just say that people have the right to revolution. What Locke also argues is that a properly constructed government will give the people the opportunity to change the government from within, right? So a revolution is a change in the government from from outside the government, right? People feel that their voices aren't being heard. They feel that they have no other alternative other than a violent uprising or taking to the streets or taking over the government in the form of some sort of revolutionary battle kind of situation. What elections do, and Locke says this is especially true if the elections are held at regularly occurring times and relatively frequently, is you give people who are unhappy the opportunity to change the leadership without changing the social contract, right? So you can elect a different president, you can elect different people to run the Senate, you can elect different people to run the state legislature or to take over the House of Representatives. And that allows for the people's voices to be heard from within the political system and makes it less likely that, as long as there are enough of them to win the elections, that the people as a whole will have to resort to revolution to try to establish change, right? So we've got an election coming up in November. So if the people decide they don't want President Trump to be president anymore, they can elect somebody else to be president, assuming that the Electoral College goes along with their choice. They can give control of the House of Representatives to the Republican Party instead of the Democratic Party. They could give control of the Senate to the Democratic Party instead of the Republican Party. Lots of state governments are also going to be electing their own governors. We're going to be electing a good portion of our state legislature in November. So if we don't like the job that the Democrats are doing, the governor, Newsom, won't be up for election, but the assembly will be up for election and half of the California State Senate will be up for election. So if the people don't like what the government in California is doing, they have a way of changing that without having a revolution. And that's one of the reasons elections are so important in democratic theory, but certainly in Locke's theory as well. And the reason he argues, and part of the reason that he argues that the legislative branch at the very least needs to be elected. Right to revolution. And then the other thing that Locke says is, okay, I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, as soon as people find out that they have a right to revolution, there's going to be constant revolution. Anytime people get pissed off about something, anytime people get angry about something, they're going to take to the streets and there's going to be revolution all the time. And Locke says, well, I have an answer to that as well. That's not going to happen. And he says, if you look at history, really what ends up happening is people don't revolt when maybe they should. He makes the argument in modern poli-sci speak, we would say that people are relatively risk averse. People are uncomfortable with change, especially large scale change from one form of government to another. There's usually a feeling amongst most people that the government that they live under is probably a pretty good form of government. It's what they've grown up with. It's what they've known all their lives. It's how they've been educated, et cetera. And so people don't just make wholesale changes to the government. It takes something really big to cause a giant revolution. I mean, think about how hard it is even just to amend the United States Constitution, much less get rid of the Constitution altogether and institute a completely new form of government. There are lots and lots of people who really don't like the Electoral College, but nobody's really been able to put a majority coalition together that would have the power to actually eliminate the Electoral College. There are some proposals out there that could make the Electoral College less important, but even those are sort of struggling to get a lot of traction or enough traction to be put into practice. So people are risk averse. People also don't revolt over small abuses of power. we have a lot of criticisms of our government. Everybody has criticisms of their government. They think that some laws are ridiculous laws. They think that the government isn't doing things that it should be doing. They would rather have a lower tax rate or a higher tax rate or less government services or more government services. So there's always going to be people who believe that the government is abusing its power in some way or another. Um, but that doesn't really lead to revolution. What leads to revolution is abuse after abuse after abuse after abuse to the point where people, something happens. Something is the straw that broke the camel's back. And at that point, the people decide that the social contract is irreparably broken. It can't be fixed by election, or the executive or the government in general has taken away the right to have elections or something like that. That's when you're going to see a revolution. People don't revolt over small abuses of power. And we're risk averse. We're a little bit worried about what will happen if we have a revolution. And so, what Locke concludes is that people will actually live under a bad government, an abusive government, a tyrannical government, even for probably longer than they should. That we're more likely to live under a bad government until we just can't live under it anymore than we are to revolt against a government that is violating our rights or abusing its power in various ways. And so Locke isn't as concerned about frequent revolution as he is not worried, but convinced, I guess, that people won't revolt, even maybe when they should. When revolution comes, it's maybe past time for the revolution to come. The other thing that Locke argues is if you set up a Republican form of government, if you set up a government that's based on democratic principles, that the people have a right to choose their government, right? That's the Republican principle of having elected officials. This form of government can tolerate a few unhappy people. So if there's 5% of the population that doesn't want to pay its taxes, or 5% of the people who refuse to stop at stop signs or something like that, the government can actually tolerate that. The system of government can tolerate that because it's very difficult for those people to spark a revolution. If most people are relatively happy participating in elections and changing the government through the electoral process, it's very difficult for a few people to screw things up for everybody else. Now, that might mean that things change more slowly than some people would like them to change. And it might mean that people, again, tolerate an abusive government for longer than they should. But Locke seems to be not very concerned about frequent revolution because he just hasn't seen it in the history of the world that there have been revolutions, even though the right to revolution exists. So that's all I had to say about this. But the next thing that we're going to be talking about are a couple of Federalist papers, and you'll see some of the principles of social contract theory, some Hobbesian, some Lockean, in the Federalist Papers. If you think about Hobbes and Locke as political theory, the US Constitution is in some ways an attempt to actually put some of that theory into practice. So that if you look at the Constitution, the preamble to the Constitution, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, right? We establish this government and we give this government power. So the Constitution is in many ways a social contract that we entered into in 1787. If you look at other aspects of early American history, at least early colonial American history, if you look at the Declaration of Independence, for example, and I will post a reading of the Declaration of Independence for you, you'll see a ton of Locke in the Declaration of Independence, especially in the preamble where it talks about natural rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It makes the argument that people form governments to protect the rights of the people, and that the people have a right to revolution and an obligation to revolution if the government abuses that power. And then if you read the entire Declaration of Independence, most people just read the preamble, but if you read the entire Declaration of Independence, it's just a list of the ways that the British government has violated the natural rights of the colonists. And so it is Locke's political theory used to justify an actual revolution. And it's really fascinating how closely it tracks with Locke's second treatise on government, and in particular this chapter that you just read. So I have a video that you can watch of people reading the Declaration of Independence. Have a great day. There it is. I'm going to post that.